First of all, Russia is not going to lose this war. And anyone who says Ukraine is winning, they don't know anything about the war. They don't read maps. If you check the map of the control over Ukraine, you know how Russia is grabbing the land in order to turn Ukraine into an inland. So it will deprive Ukraine from its geopolitical importance. Russia doesn't need to occupy Ukraine. They just need to occupy from Donetsk, the Donbas region, okay, all to Mariupol and all the way to Odessa. Just the belt. And when they do that, Ukraine is irrelevant.
Welcome to Redacted Conversations. I'm Clayton Morris. On this show, we invite whistleblowers, journalists, and interesting people to share their stories. As human beings, we always look for connections. We're always looking to connect the dots. It's what we do. It's in our DNA. And sometimes these connections are hidden from the public because of propaganda and lies driven by Western media and intelligence organizations. In the great conflicts of the world right now, there are a lot of connections that they hope you won't notice in Ukraine, in Syria, and beyond. Well, someone who's been shedding light on this is my guest today. His name is Kevork Almassian. He's an independent journalist covering geopolitics with a special focus on Syria and Armenia. He runs the independent YouTube channel called Syria Analysis. I encourage you all to check it out. And just like this channel, he doesn't get any funding from billionaire corporations that tell him what to say, what to produce, what videos to put out. And that's how he manages to actually report truth on the major issues of our time. Kevork, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Clayton. It's a really pleasure.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you. Can you give our audience a little background where you are in the world, and how did you decide to get into this racket like the rest of us?
First of all, I was born and raised in Syria. I'm Syrian, but I have an Armenian origin. So my grandparents survived the Armenian genocide 3 generations ago, and they found a shelter in Syria. So I was born in Syria, and since my childhood, I grew up in a very politicized environment, let's say, because of the genocide that all the grandparents start telling their grandchildren. And later, because of the situation in the Middle East, especially with the invasion of Iraq, I was pretty much touched by what happened in Iraq, although I was just a kid. And, back then, Syria had really bad relations with Saddam Hussein. But despite that, we were all against the war because we knew this was not about Saddam Hussein. This was about destroying Iraq and turning it into a failed state. And we knew that destroying a country like Iraq with a rich civilization, which can project its cultural and civil, let's say, leverage over the region, will have its impact also on Syria, because Syria also has a similar, let's say, social fabric. And we knew that after the fall of Iraq, the turn is coming for Syria. And it wasn't like a conspiracy theory. It was the United States saying that we're coming for you. You have to follow our instructions. It was Colin Powell in Syria after the fall of Saddam Hussein that he told President Bashar al-Assad that you have to follow these steps. If not, it's your turn. So we understood the message since then, but we didn't expect that the war could come on Syria from a non-conventional method like this one. We expected an invasion by the United States. Maybe we expected an invasion by Israel, but like a 4th generation of asymmetrical warfare that the CIA waged in Syria was very new for the Syrians and also for the Syrian government. In my observation, they were very bad in handling the crisis from the beginning. They didn't master any of the skills that the United States has in terms of propaganda warfare, in terms of creating public opinions in Syria based on media narratives. For example, there are people who still believe until this moment, like I'm a Syrian and they're Syrians, but I was the one who from the beginning, I was capturing lots of videos online, saving them for later. They still believe there were, for example, mass graves, there were chemical attacks, and these are also Syrians. But their narratives or their understanding of the conflict was basically based on what few media channels were feeding them. Especially on top of them is Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera played a very destructive role in Syria, and they injected so much sectarianism, hatred, social hatred, sectarian hatred, religious hatred, into extent that they even started calling ISIS Islamic State, because in Syria we call them Daesh. So they gave them legitimacy, let's say, in one way or another. In my part in 2011, I was studying master in political science in Lebanon, and I just felt out of my sense of patriotism. Right? I know it's something now. A lot of people think in the Western communities that it is equal to nationalism or stuff. No, it's the self of belonging to a country and your will and feelings that you want to protect this country against a foreign aggressor. So I put, although I was studying, I was writing my graduation project back then, the dissertation. I wasted no time. I joined the political activism on social media, because a lot of campaigning that happened in Syria was through social media, and thankfully I learned a lot from Western activists who were also genuine in their reporting. I learned their style and their honesty also with the audience, how to respect the brain of the audience. It's very important. Lots of journalists nowadays, especially in the corporate media, they treat their audience like sheep. Like when I listen them for more than 1 minute, I already feel insulted. Like my brain feels like from inside somebody is fooling me. It's so obvious. And this is what I was saying a few times. The corporate media is so powerful, but they're not creative. They have been repeating or recycling similar tactics starting from Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now in Ukraine. And I truly astonished how the people fail for the same script, just changing the names, not only once or twice or three times, multiple times. But in my opinion, the emotional mobilization, right, for the people, especially in Europe nowadays, it made people distance themselves from logic. I genuinely think that their reporting is harmful. It is harming the ordinary people. It is killing people. In Aleppo, where I come from, in 2016, the reporting of the mainstream media about Al Qaeda, they were calling them moderate rebels. Al Qaeda, which they were murdering people in Aleppo based on their religion. If you don't go to prayer on Fridays, they lynch you in the streets. They decapitated 13-year-old boy in the streets, and they were proudly showing the head of that small kid in front of the public. All these horrendous crimes that you can't imagine, the media whitewashed them, and this gives Al Qaeda credibility and also political cover and media cover. And that's how they continued occupying half the city of Aleppo for 4 years. So media was complicit. They created a certain, let's say, situation in Syria, and they preserved that situation in order for the war to continue. Because at the end of the day, when you follow the media, it's so childish. They just try to tell you, oh, there is this brutal dictator. He's waking up in the morning and he just takes up the map and he chooses which town he has to bomb today and bomb them with chemical weapons, right? This is it. I mean, I'm not even exaggerating. This is how they
Right.
portray him. And then why they are doing that, now in 2021, we know all the facts. We know that the CIA launched a covert operation. It was Timber Sycamore. It was funded up to $1 billion. This was one of the costliest CIA covert operations abroad in Syria in order to topple President Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because Bashar al-Assad and before him, his father, they had foreign policies that the United States doesn't like. It's that simple. But because the United States recently, they were trying to minimize their presence in the Middle East because they wanted to focus in Central Asia and now in Ukraine, as we see after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they wanted to neutralize any threat uh, uh, that can pose against Israel. And this is the point. This war in Syria that started 11 years ago, because Syria was the only country in the Middle East still who says no to an agreement with Israel based on what Israel wants. Because at the end, there are international law, and according to the UN, the Golan Heights belong to Syria, and they are territories that belong to the Palestinians that Israel has to give up, and they are the refugees that have to go back to their country. So Syria wanted to strike a deal with Israel multiple times, but based on a just peace, not in the terms of what Israel wants. And because Israel never signed on a deal with Syria, Syria continued supporting the armed resistance against the occupation forces, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Lebanon. And we saw the consequences of that. In 2006, Syria opened all its stockpile to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they used all the weapons Syria has in order to kick Israel again out of Lebanon in 2006. And in 2008, for the first time, the militant groups in Gaza, they started using cornets. From where did they get the cornets? The Russian cornets. This from the stockpile of Syria. So Israel knows this, and therefore, in order to neutralize, as I mentioned, this threat on Israel, they decided to destroy Syria and turn it into ashes. And what we have seen now after 11 years, it's pretty obvious that the regime change in its classical terms, the military terms, has failed. They couldn't topple the regime in Syria, quote unquote. Although they didn't win the war, but the Syrian side didn't win as well, because half the country is destroyed, the infrastructure is gone, the economy is below zero, the living wage, the wages are you could cry if you if you know what are the salaries. It's like $50-$60 per month, people living in Syria, because of the very high inflation and the sanctions and the destruction and no infrastructure. And now, because of the sanctions, you cannot even import lots of goods. For example, the United States imposes sanctions on lots of technologies and goods that if a third country, for example, in the Philippines, they produce a product that consists of 10% of American technology, you cannot sell that product to Syria because of sanctions. If you're a Syrian, if you want to open a bank account anywhere in the world, with dollars, you cannot, because you could be suspected of being I don't know, terrorists or something. If you want to send anyone anything through PayPal, for example, it would be blocked. So Syrians are strangled at the moment, unfortunately, and I don't see any outrage. It's like you have 17 to 18 million people in an open air, like it's like a prison, not in the sense like they're imprisoned there, but they're detached from the outside world, and they're strangling them because they think by impoverishing the people in Syria, like they did in Iraq, at the end the people will rise against the government. And but what is happening is exactly the opposite, because if there were any independent people in Syria who could have managed their expenses independently, now everyone is dependent on the government. Everybody needs the government now to secure their basic needs. Therefore, the increased dependency on the government also increases the loyalty to the government, because the people are becoming more dependent on what the government can present to them. So their sanctions are very counterproductive. They're slowly killing the Syrian people, and I don't see any outrage out there. So what I really ask for, I condemn literally killing any innocent civilian in Ukraine. However, I also expect similar sympathy with 500,000 people died in Syria in the course of the regime change war, right? And before that, 500,000 children in Iraq. And around 1 million Iraqis died after 2003, and millions refugees. How do you think all this happened in the region? It was very wrong foreign policy choices of the United States. And behind the United States is Israel, who was pushing Washington to pursue these destructive policies in the Middle East. Therefore, it is very important nowadays to have a multipolar world where there are other parties participating in the decision-making on the international community level. So when the United States says the international community, it's so laughable. It's maybe 20 countries out of 181 or 91 countries in the world, right? So
Right.
We need to include rising powers such as Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Brazil. Lots of nations should have a say in these decisions. And when we have a certain level of participation of these nations, it could decrease the chances of the United States to have the tendencies to dominate the world and therefore to go for wars, because lots of people in the United States, this is, I think, I'm paraphrasing Chomsky, that a lot of people in the United States do not know that their country is an empire, and they do not know that they do not know. you know,
Right.
it is so crazy how.
Well, and it's so frustrating because you have so many people who change their Twitter emoji to a Ukrainian flag, and throughout the United States, they're hanging Ukrainian flags in the front yard, and yet the atrocities that have been happening in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen, I mean, the list of Somalia, the list is endless. But for Western media coverage and Americans, it's been focused on Ukraine. But I think that is starting to change, and I think what we try to do here on the show, at least, is to try to, to bring awareness about this hypocrisy and the money that's funneling there. You're starting to see a crack, but $40 billion last week sent to Ukraine. More is on its way, and it's going to continue for some time. And it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. Now, you've been covering Syria for quite a while. Can you talked a little bit about the $50-$60 a month, the infrastructure there crushed, a reliance now on central government. Can you give our audience a better understanding, for those that don't know, that don't understand the history here? What exactly was the Western involvement in making Syria into what it is today, specifically the CIA and the Western intervention?
So it is very important to go back just 1 or 2 years before 2011, when the war erupted in Syria, the Arab Spring, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is no clear evidence whether it was planned or not. We do not know clearly if the Arab Spring was planned in the region. But the way it developed, it was pretty clear that the pro-democratic party in the United States forces, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, they were rising to power in the region. And this started to happen in Tunisia, and then in Egypt, and half of Libya, and then they started in Syria. It was a clear indication that the region under Obama and Hillary Clinton was going into what we say in Arabic, ikhwanization. Ikhwanization means the Muslim Brotherhood in Arabic called Ikhwan al-Muslimin. So it's like the trying to Islamize the entire region and make it one color, right? And this was basically meant to isolate Iran. They wanted to create a very strong force in the Arab region based on the Sunni forces, but not secular Sunni forces. Those are the Muslim Brotherhood who believe in an Islamic state, but through elections. They perceive elections as some sort of a train that they can join the train and arrive to their destination. And when they arrive to their destination, they get out of the train and they start ruling it according to the Sharia laws. And this started happening in Egypt. Syria was hit by a similar wave in 2011, and it was clear from the beginning, from the slogans. The first protests that started in Syria, the Islamists were calling for shutting down mixed schools. Like, they don't want girls and boys to go together to the same school. They were asking that the veiled women, that you can't see their face, they should go back to the teaching sector, because in Syria it was banned for a woman who is covered completely to teach, because there should be a human interaction with the student, right? So it was pretty clear where this is heading from day one. And then it started to develop. The Islamists started calling for extermination of the minorities. They want to send the Christians. They say, we want to send the Christians to Beirut and the Alawites to the coffins. This is a very famous slogan. So any sane person can see that this wasn't a democratic demonstrations happening in Syria, but it was portrayed by the corporate media as being democratic rebels calling for freedom and democracy. And of course, there were many enthusiastic people, also my friends and others, who thought that this could lead to a positive change in Syria. And Syria needs to be changed. Syria has to develop its political system, its parliamentary system, and should have more free press and more political participation. Everybody agrees on this. But what we don't agree is we don't want to push the clock back, because the Islamists are regressive forces. You cannot trust an Islamist telling you they want a democratic system. No, there is democracy and Islam. They don't match. It's simple. It's like you cannot say communism and capitalism match. They are two different school of thoughts. You cannot really fool people and say you want democracy while you're calling for Sharia laws. So the Western governments invested so heavily in these groups. They started funding them on a media level at the beginning in 2011. Lots of Facebook pages, media outlets, radio stations, TV channels. They were all created inside Syria when these areas started to get out of the control of the government. They established radio channels funded by the MI6, radio channels or TV channels, YouTube channels funded by the CIA. Also later in Turkey. In 2011, they thought that they want to create a very big demonstration against the government, that the government will crumble. But they made a miscalculation that the government has a very big supporting base too. And millions of people went to the streets in support of the government. And a lot of them, not because they like the government, but because they know what the alternative is, right?
Right.
So when this chaos that they wanted to trigger in the beginning didn't work, they started funding the jihadists. And this was when the Timber Sycamore program started, which is the CIA covert operation. In 2012, the CIA started funding the jihadi groups in Syria. And when the Defense Intelligence Agency, I think in 2013, warned Barack Obama that the strongest force against Assad are the Islamists, he ignored that report. And they all knew, himself and Hillary Clinton, and the emails of Hillary Clinton also indicate that one of her aides, I think Blumenthal,
Sid Blumenthal, yeah.
yeah, I think, who sent an email that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Everybody knew and understood this in Syria, because there is no one in Syria who would continue fighting the government unless he is a strongly has a strong ideology. And those people are the Muslim Brotherhood, and behind them Al-Qaeda, and then ISIS. So what the United States did, they created a brand called the Free Syrian Army. Those are the moderate rebels. And they said there are 80,000 moderate rebels in Syria, and there is no mechanism to count them. It's just a number stated without a source, right? But there were think tankers who were repeating this, like Charles Lister, who created a list of 80 or to 90,000 of moderate rebels in Syria, including Shamia, who later they were decapitating children in Syria. Anyways, so it was a collusion between these think tanks and the media outlets, and behind them the CIA. And underground, there were ethnic cleansing operations happening against minorities in many places in Syria, including in Hama, in Homs, in northern Latakia, in a town called Kesab, which is an Armenian town where the Turkish-backed terrorists invaded, and they wanted to massacre the Armenians again for the second time after 100 years of the genocide against them, right? So it was a complete, comprehensive, let's say, different levels of a program, starting from the media, the political, and then the military. And when the military also didn't work, and Russia intervened, Iran intervened, Hezbollah intervened on the side of the government, now we move to the chemical weapon hysteria. And until this moment, all the chemical attacks that allegedly happened in Syria were not investigated neither carefully nor objectively. Just an example, in 2017, there was allegedly a chemical attack in Khan Sheikhun. And what happened is, when the attack happened, allegedly, of course, Syria asked for the OPCW team to come to Syria and investigate. And they didn't send experts because they said the geography is very dangerous. although that area is more or less was under a Turkish leverage. And who collected the samples? The white helmets. And the white helmets are established by a former MI6 security. He was an officer in the MI6,
Right.
and we all know why this organization was created. So you cannot rely on an organization that is heavily embedded with foreign intelligence agencies to collect samples for you. And I myself, I have videos for them collecting samples, and there are people walking next to the scene with sandals. They're saying there is a sarin gas attack there, and people walking there without masks and sandals, and they're asking what's wrong because they don't know what happened. And if there was a chemical attack, a sarin chemical attack, and if we calculate the wind direction, for example, the entire town should be dead.
Right.
And not 40 people or 50 people of a sarin gas. That would never happen. And in 2018 is the same. In Duma, alleged chemical attack happened that I think it never happened. There was no chemical attack in Duma in 2018. But the OPCW final report indicated that the cylinder that the chlorine gas came from was from a helicopter of a Syrian army that dropped that cylinder. And then the whistleblowers came from the OPCW, Jan Henderson and the rest of the team, who were on the ground in Syria and investigating. And they said clearly that the administration of the OPCW, under pressure from the United States, they took out an entire paragraphs from the final findings of the OPCW to make it look like government did this, the Syrian government did this chemical attack or alleged chemical attack there. And the engineering team can check where the cylinder can fall, and when it falls there, how should it stand, right? So they were making lots of analysis there that doesn't fit the narrative, especially when you drop a cylinder and it comes from the roof of your building and then it sits over a bed. The bed is untouched. It's like as if you threw a pillow over the bed and it stands like they're like sleeping over the bed. Seriously, like you don't need to be an expert in such cases sometimes because it's so funny and so hilarious. How can they sell that photo as an evidence for a chemical attack in Syria?
We have a saying, right? Which I think it's a Mark Twain saying, which is, a lie can travel all the way around the world before the truth has a chance to put on his pants, in the morning. And so, wow, Assad is gassing his own people. That's the narrative that the Western media runs with, the BBC runs with, CNN runs with it. And then before the truth has a chance to even come out, that story is already out there.
Yeah, and it is still in 2022, for example, when I tell somebody asks me about my political opinion on Syria, and I'm very honest, telling them what I think, like I did to you, and they're like, so you are with that evil dictator who's gassing his own people? And I'm like, okay, so you say gassing his own, please give me an example. Which one? Let's discuss,
Right.
And unfortunately, ignorance nowadays, it's very annoying for me because hundreds of thousands of people died, and we cried for every single human who perished, including my friends and lots of relatives. My brother was kidnapped by this terrorist. We know what war means. And when somebody comes still talking about Assad is gassing his own people, it's like he's putting a lemon on your wound, And I'm not saying Assad is a saint. There is no saint politician in the world. And they all crave for power and authority. And at the end, I'm pretty sure Assad has his own also personal calculations. But if you see the entire picture, if Assad left the country and said, okay, you want the power, take it, I think Syria would have gone forever. If the Islamists ruled Syria, because Syria is a very multicultural country, and all these multi-culti promoters who say we want multicultural and multi-ethnic countries in the Western societies, we need to receive more migrants and refugees, etc., rightly so in some cases, They don't
Right.
want for Syria to be a multicultural country. They are supporting people who want to make Syria a one colored and one type of society, where we have around 7,000 years of civilization. Armenians, for example, aren't only in Syria like 100 years ago after the genocide. There was an Armenian empire that stretched from the from nowadays Baku till Syria. This was before Christianity, the
Hmm.
second century before Christianity. So it's a very rich, multicultural Greek Orthodox, let's say the Catholics, the Druze, the Alevis, the Sunnis, the Shiites, the Jews, so many, over 20 different communities living in harmony. And when I say living in harmony, that is also because there was a strong government there. And when there is a strong government that can force the laws and the regulations justly on everyone, there would be a better, let's say, interaction between these communities. But when you weaken this government and you make some of the communities feel threatened, like there is an existential threat against them because of these Islamists, all the fabric starts to crumble. And because of the war, it really crumbled. Multiple times there were clashes between these communities because of the war, and not because of the sanctions. The sanctions are also crumbling the hierarchy of the Syrian society, and a lot of doctors, engineers, scientists, mathematicians, political scientists, name it, they're leaving Syria for good.
Hmm.
Germany now, the biggest foreign doctors in percentage in Germany are Syrians, the
Wow.
biggest percentage. So just imagine all these doctors were in Syria. Aleppo had the biggest and largest free cancer treatment hospital in the entire Middle East. It was
Wow.
called Al Kindi Hospital.
Hmm.
And you know what? And you know what they did with this Kindi Hospital? They this Al Nusra Front, they sent a truck full of explosions, and they blew up the entire um, this infrastructure, entire hospital. And when you read on the BBC, they said the rebels capture an Assad stronghold. An Assad stronghold. This
A
is what
cancer,
they
a
report.
cancer hospital. And we've seen a lot of the similarities in Ukraine, right? And I want to kind of get to some of these connections here because we're seeing the same thing repeated in large way in Ukraine. But with this increased right now in Syria, with this increased Israeli bombardment of Syria, and now you have Turkey's Erdogan declaring more wanting more Syrian lands in the north. Moscow is upset about this. Moscow, President Putin saying they're alarmed over the Turkish military operations in northern Syria. Where do things stand today in Syria with these outside influence?
Unfortunately, Syria is in a weak position, and Syria needs the Russian backing to disallow Erdogan in his operations in the north, because Turkey is a NATO country. And if you, by any chance, bomb any Turkish installation, for example, either knowingly or unknowingly inside Turkey, then you're bombing a NATO member, and Turkey can ask NATO for protection, right?
Right.
And leaked audio, I think it was by WikiLeaks in 2014 or 15. It was Davut Oglu, the former foreign minister of Turkey. In this leak audio, he says, even if it takes us to send someone to Syria and bomb us in Turkey to trigger a NATO war on Syria, we will do it. So he wanted to send our forces to Syria, covert operation, and ask them to bomb Turkey in order for NATO to intervene.
Bomb
Because
himself.
yes, and because in 2015, when Russia intervened, Turkey was buying the oil from ISIS. There were hundreds of tankers, hundreds, like you can't even see where it starts and where it ends, that ISIS is stealing the oil of Syria and selling it to Turkey. And Turkey was buying them with cheap prices. and then they're selling it to the black market. And even the son of Erdogan was involved in this operation. So the first thing Russia did when they intervened in Syria, they bombed all these trackers. And it's pretty obvious with the satellite images. And let me ask here a question. If Turkey was buying all these tankers every day from ISIS, and it is a NATO country, and there is a very big NATO base in southern Turkey, does anyone have any doubt that NATO wasn't complicit in this?
Right.
Like they were watching
fully aware of it. Right.
fully aware. And John Kerry again in 2015 leaked audio when he was meeting with Syrian opposition members, of course, quote unquote, in Washington. He is telling the Syrian opposition that we were watching ISIS advance from Palmyra to Damascus because we thought that this will pressure Assad and force him into concessions. So they knew ISIS was advancing from Palmyra to Damascus, and they let them, although the US-led campaign against ISIS started in 2014, but they allowed ISIS to expand because they wanted ISIS to practice pressure on ISIS for him to make concessions to the United States. And then he says, but we didn't expect that Russia could come and join on the Syrian side. Mm-hmm. So all these leaked documents are quite clear who's on whose side there.
We're talking about these connections that you and I were talking about before the show, and one of the big similarities I see is Ukraine war and Syria, and it's the Western control through sanctions. So we kind of touched on sanctions a little bit, but we're certainly seeing now in Ukraine and through Russia the crushing sanctions on what it's doing to Africa. Not a lot of attention is paid to that region, to the United States, and to Europe, all under the auspices of crushing Putin. But the same thing, of course, happening in Syria. Can you talk through some of the sanctions issues that you've experienced in Syria?
The sanctions that are called unilateral coercive measures, first of all, they're illegal under international law because they're not approved by the UN Security Council, and there was no voting. It's just the EU and the United States impose harsh sanctions on several sectors, the most importantly on the banking sector and on the central bank. They make the transaction impossible. Mm-hmm. They say we are not sanctioning the Syrian people, we're just sanctioning the Syrian regime, and we're sanctioning his central bank. But if there is no banking system working in Syria, operating or system in Syria, when the banks are not allowed to operate in Syria, and when transaction companies are all sanctioned if they operate in Syria, how can the Syrian government buy a material from the outside world? So you're sanctioning the Syrian government who is providing these basic necessities to the people, right? And in order to make life harder on the Syrian people, the United States occupies now, as we speak, 50% of Syria's oil and gas fields in the eastern shores of the Euphrates.
Wow. And
when the American journalists go to report from there, they say the Americans are guarding the oil fields of Syria. But guarding from who? It's like they occupy your oil fields and they're guarding it. They're just keeping the oil there so that nobody can use the Syrian government can't use that energy resources because Syria is highly dependent on gas and oil for heating, for example, for cooking. So imagine during winter times, you don't have a heating in your apartment, and I know this for a fact. People sleep in freezing conditions. There is no heating for a very long winter times. So sanctions on the banking sector, sanctions on the energy sector, sanctions on the reconstruction sector, anything that you need for reconstruction of Syria. The exceptions are the medical and the humanitarian aid. But the humanitarian aid, they choose and pick which organization they're going to send this aid, and they are mostly outside the control of the Syrian government. So they send to these what is left in Idlib or northern Syria where Turkey occupies and where the American forces occupy. They send aid to these areas, but not to the Syrian government area where the vast majority of the people live there. But even with these exceptions, when you make, as I mentioned, banking illegal, you can't buy anything because you need materials. Your infrastructure is destroyed. And let's be brutally honest, neither Russia nor Iran are able to reconstruct Syria. Financially speaking, economically speaking, they are not capable to do it. If there is a state that can reconstruct Syria, it is China. But China, they're also hesitant to do it because they want to. Chinese, they're positively neutral. Like they are on the side of the government, but they don't want to involve heavily in the heavy details of the Syrian war. Right? They use veto in the UN Security Council, but beyond that, they don't really give tangible, let's say, support. If they want to tangibly support Syria, they want peace and order to be restored in Syria, and then they think of investing in that country. So what option Syria have? Saudi Arabia, Emirates, Qatar, all these rich countries, right, in the Gulf. And all these countries waged a brutal war on Syria in the past 11 years. And only recently, Mohammed bin Jassim, who was the former foreign minister of Qatar, he said on a Qatari TV that Bandar bin Sultan was called Bandar Bush, if you remember. During the 9/11 days, he was the ambassador of Saudi Arabia in Washington,
Right.
very close to George Bush. He became the head of the intelligence, the Saudi intelligence, in 2013 and 2014. And he asked the Gulf governments to allocate $2 trillion, $2 trillion for Syria. He wanted to allocate $2 trillion to remove Bashar Assad from power in Syria. Of course, they couldn't collect all this money, but my estimate is this is beyond $200 billion operation in Syria, especially by Qatar and Saudi Arabia. They spend so much money.
What is the end game for these Western countries spending that money? What is their end goal?
The end goal was to remove Assad. The end goal now is to keep things as it is. To keep things as it is in order they're disintegrating the Syrian society. They are making all the educated people leave the country. They're turning the country into a failed state. So they say to Assad, okay, you won the war, but we will make this place a jungle and you will be a ruler of a jungle. No more a nation there. So enjoy that. This is the end game. They want Syria to be a pariah state or a failed state, to be permanently dysfunctioned country that can't rule itself, can't protect itself, can't support its own people and provide the basic needs. And now Turkey is again, they want to wage a special operation in the north. And for Turkey, it's pretty clear. They want to occupy the northern belt for two reasons. One, they want to send back the refugees from Turkey to these areas. And by doing so, they're going to change the demographics of that area. It's a complete demographic change what Turkey is doing in the north, especially by kicking out the Kurdish people, the Assyrian people, the Armenian people, in order to send, let's say, people who are more loyal to Erdogan. So even if in the future Russia was able somehow to force Turkey out of Syria, but when you change the demographics of these places and you send the people who are loyal to Erdogan, you will have a regions of influence in Syria. So that stretches from Idlib to Azaz, Afrin, Jarablos, all the way to Hasaki and Kamishli, all the north. And this is not new for the Syrians. In the 1930s, Turkey already occupied what is called today Hatay region, which is Iskenderun in Arabic. And they changed the demographics of the area and they hold a referendum for separation and they took it. So I suspect the end goal for Erdogan is to do similar thing, to change the demographics of the area, and then say these people want to join Turkey. They don't want to live in, but these areas have been completely cleansed from its original people, right? Therefore, I think that is very difficult to do, especially with Russia is in that part. But at the same time, the Russian position is not as strong that one might think with Turkey, because it's very complex, the situation now after the attempt coup against Erdogan, that Erdogan understood that CIA really tried to get rid of him in 2016. So he started to distribute his eggs in different baskets and not be heavily only with NATO. So he wants to open channels now also with Russia, and Russia benefited from it. Russia has a good economic relations now with Turkey. They have, let's say, good political relations again with Turkey, especially in the past 2-3 years. And now the fruit of it one can see in Ukraine. Although Turkey is on the side of Ukraine theoretically, but if Turkey wants, they can harm Russia way more if the relations weren't as good as it is now, like closing the phosphorus, for example, in front of the Russians, or sending heavier arms to Ukraine. But they are doing, let's say, a cosmetic help to Ukraine, and they're preserving this maneuvering periphery with Russia again. And Russia needs Turkey, so Russia is not going to anger Erdogan into extent that they may lose Ukraine. I think the top priority for Russia is Ukraine. Ukraine is an existential battlefield for Russia, and regardless of the president in the Kremlin, I think only Boris Yeltsin wouldn't have done it because he's a drunk, but anyone except Boris Yeltsin would have gone for a war in Ukraine from a Russian perspective, because the expansion of NATO, people do not understand that NATO is not European Union. Like when you join the European Union, that doesn't mean you have nuclear weapons and heavy armaments on your country directed on Russia. NATO is completely different alliance. It's a defensive alliance that imposes every nation that joins NATO to have certain criteria, military criteria, and they have to accept military hardware, technologies, spying centers in this country against Russia. First of all, Russia is not going to lose this war, and anyone who says Ukraine is winning, they don't know anything about the war. They don't read maps. If you check the map of the control over Ukraine, you know how Russia is grabbing the land in order to turn Ukraine into an inland. So it will deprive Ukraine from its geopolitical importance. Russia doesn't need to occupy Ukraine. They just need to occupy from Donetsk, the Donbas region, okay, all to Mariupol and all the way to Odessa. Just the belt. And when they do that, Ukraine is irrelevant. They will lose their geopolitical importance, and they will lose the wheat. And this is very important. The food security that we were talking about. So after this war, Russia will be in control of like a very big share of the energy and a very big share of the wheat. So it will have Russia will come out of this war stronger, and those who will pay the heaviest price are the European countries, and especially Germany. United States is gonna suffer economically, and but in Europe, I think there is an existential threat in terms of the economies. What is happening in Germany is it's I don't know if it's funny or people can see it. The Greens in Germany, they're completely different from the Greens from the United States. They're pro-NATO more than the Secretary General of NATO himself. And they came to power just 1.5 years ago, right? And now this war started. And the Greens came to power like they want to ban the Nord Stream 2. They want to ban all the energy and stuff. They want all green energy. And now the time came for them to cut the energy with Russia. And what's happening to the market? How can the factories survive if there is no Nord Stream, there is no coal energy, and there is no nuclear energy? How are these companies going to work? So my humble opinion is there is an unspoken plot against Germany to deindustrialize the country. They want to make Germany a very weak economy in Europe, dominated maybe by France. They want only one leader in Europe that could be France for now. And in a multipolar world, Germany should not have a say. They want Germany to be weak economically, so Berlin cannot have a strong presence and role in any multipolar world, because the United States also knows the world is changing, and there is no way to stop China and Russia and India from rising in this international system. And therefore, to exclude one of the biggest competitors and keep it under heavy control of the United States was first through the infiltration of the government, through the Social Democrats and the Greens, that they are now in power. And two, now by the decisions that they have taken to destroy the German economy and keep it weak and under full control of the United States. Even the Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, he says something today, and tomorrow, like just tomorrow, 180-degree different statement. He says we cannot cut the energy with Russia. It's like we don't have an alternative. The second day he comes out and he says the opposite, and he takes the opposite decision. So what has changed from yesterday till today? Maybe a phone call.
Right. Yes. Washington gives him a phone call. Ursula von der Leyen gives a phone call and makes that change. Yeah. It's remarkable. I guess I want to get you out of here on this, Kevork. Where do you see the next, maybe give me a 5-year window into what happens in Syria? It's hard to say where we see Ukraine going. We could continue this proxy war. We could continue to funnel countless weapons into this region. It could wind up like Henry Kissinger says, which is a concession of Donbass down to Crimea, that belt, as you say, and then it's over. Yes. But in Syria, it seems different. This week, the European Union extended illegal sanctions on Syria for another year. These sanctions are killing the Syrian people. So a 5-year timeline horizon, what do you see happening?
I think it's very difficult to predict, but based on what we see underground, I think the situation in Syria is not frozen. There is no prospect of any political solution or military solution underground, because one of the main players involved in the Syrian war, Russia, is now heavily busy in Ukraine. And the Syrians also watching the Ukrainian war closely, because the outcome of the war will have its repercussions on Syria. If Russia loses this war, it will have a very devastating consequences on Syria itself. Russia isn't losing, so I think the war in Ukraine will take another 2 or 3 years. After that, Russia will be able to project its power better in the Middle East, especially when Putin is networking now with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to keep the oil prices somehow higher in his favor. So I think when the war ends in Ukraine, there will be an attempt to capture the eastern shores of the Euphrates from the Americans, because the Americans have no future in Syria. They cannot stay in like 2,000 soldiers occupying quarter of the country with no backup plan and no fortifications, no military bases, etc., etc. They're going to leave, but they're going to leave from their perspective when they empower the Kurdish separatists into extent that they can govern themselves. But that's not going to happen, because the Kurdish separatists also, they will have a situation like they're like an island. Turkey is opposing them. Even the Syrians are opposing them. Syrians want to include the Kurds, like the Armenians and any other community, in the Syrian society. They don't want them to get 50% of the oil and the wheat just for them, right? And they're not even majority in the eastern shores of the Euphrates. They're 30% of if you check the ethnicities of the people living there. So the Idlib is a very big priority, I think, for the entire world. It's the largest safe haven for Al-Qaeda terrorists in the entire world now. It's in Al-Qaeda, where the Green Party calls it, of Germany, the last bastion of democracy in Syria. And after, yes, and with Turkey, and in with Turkey, it will be solved politically. There is no way to fight against Turkey. Turkey is a very strong. It's a NATO country, and it's irreasonable to launch any attack on Turkey inside, let's say, Turkish territories or etc. So Russia will solve the northern problem with Turkey, and in the eastern shores of the Euphrates, Americans will withdraw. So Syrians have to strike a deal with the Kurds there, unless there is a very bad scenario that could happen. And I'm reading recently a lot that there could be a war between Israel, Syria, Hezbollah, and Iran. I hope it's not true, but a lot of people believe that this is the end game, because they think this is started in Syria because of Israel, and it should end with a direct confrontation between these parties with Israel. So everyone knows its balance of power and their limits, and then they can maybe negotiate on a settlement, which I truly suspect there would be any settlement with Israel in the near future.
Damning prospects all around. You know, I always want to try to leave people with like a positive note, but it seems like more war, and continued Western sanctions and more people in destruction in these regions.
You're very correct. I mean, look, I'm not a really optimist about the situation in Syria, because I truly believe deep inside that these Western political elites have no morals at all. Like completely detached from their humanity. They do not care at all. When Madeleine Albright was asked about 500,000 children died in Iraq, she said the price was worth it. So I think every Western politician imposing sanctions on Syria, they think the price is worth it for anyone who dies now from the freezing conditions, for example, in Syria, or a father who can't secure a bread for his kids, or a milk, or a medicine, etc., etc. So I think everyone in this elite, they say the same, but silently, something that Madeleine Albright said 2 decades ago.
Yeah, and then they celebrate Madeleine Albright with a big funeral and, you know, front pages of newspapers and the celebration of this woman, and it's just disgusting. Well, Kevork, keep doing the work that you're doing. You're shedding valuable insight and light on these stories, and I'm going to have a link to make sure that people can learn more about your work over at Syria Analysis. I would welcome you to come back here anytime. We would love to have you here on the show to continue to bring these stories to our audience and the world.
I am honored, Clayton, to be your host, and I'm really thankful for hosting me and also shedding light on the truth always has two sides. We have to investigate, we have to dig in, and what you're doing is really amazing, because you have a very big platform and you're reaching to lots of people. And as you said, there are lots of people changing their minds, and change starts from the smaller circle. We are individuals. If we influence our friends, and the circle starts to grow and grow and grow. And what you're doing in YouTube, nobody should underestimate it. Millions of people are watching YouTube every day, and the millions of people can change their mind. And because these people are voting and choosing politicians, maybe they would choose less warmonger politicians for the sake of the other people around the world.
That's the goal. That's the goal. That's the goal. Exactly. Well, thank you so much. And I that's why I said at the beginning, I think this is going to be a really powerful conversation. So please, you know, to all of you out there who watched this interview, please share it with your friends. Please put this out on social media. Get this message out there about these lies that we are told by the Western media and Western foreign governments that, or the Western governments that continue to keep this cycle of war on the cycle of poverty going in order to enrich them and to maintain this, you know, this illegal imperial hegemony over the world. So Kevork, I thank you so much again. We'll have a link up in the description to your channel. Thank you for doing this amazing work, and we will see you real soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.